The morning of December 10, 1541, broke grey and bitter over London. Francis Dereham pressed his face against the cold stone of his tower cell, watching the pale winter sun struggle through the heavy clouds. His breath formed small puffs of mist in the frigid air, each one a reminder that he was still alive, for now. In just a few hours, he would be dragged through the streets of London to face the most brutal execution method the Tudor justice system could devise. At barely 35 years old, Francis had once been a man of promise. Born into minor nobility in Norfolk, he had possessed the kind of easy charm and quick wit that opened doors at court. He had been handsome enough to catch the eye of young Catherine Howard, clever enough to navigate the treacherous waters of Tudor politics, and ambitious enough to believe he might rise higher than his birth suggested. Now, as he sat in his cell awaiting the most horrifying death imaginable, he must have wondered how a few stolen kisses and whispered promises had led him to this moment. But Francis Dereham's story was more than just a tale of star-crossed lovers destroyed by royal jealousy. It was a glimpse into the savage machinery of Tudor justice, where the king's will was absolute law, and where the punishment for treason was designed not just to kill, but to terrorize. What awaited Francis at Tyburn was not a quick death, but a carefully orchestrated spectacle of suffering that would serve as a warning to anyone who dared to cross Henry VIII. The method chosen for Francis was hanging, drawing, and quartering, a punishment so brutal that even hardened executioners sometimes flinched at its implementation. This was not merely an execution. It was a systematic destruction of the human body, carried out in front of cheering crowds who had come to witness the king's justice. For Francis, who had once held Catherine Howard in his arms and dreamed of a future together, the irony was devastating. Love had brought him to power, and love would destroy him in the most horrible way possible. To understand the horror of Francis Dereham's execution, we must first understand the relationship that sealed his fate. In 1538, Catherine Howard was not yet queen. She was barely more than a child, perhaps 14 or 15 years old, living under the loose supervision of her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. The Duchess's household was a sprawling establishment where young nobles and their servants lived in close quarters, with minimal supervision and maximum opportunity for mischief. Francis Dereham arrived at this household as a gentleman's servant, a position that placed him somewhere between a courtier and a domestic worker. He was educated, well-spoken, and possessed of the kind of smooth confidence that made him popular among both the male and female inhabitants of the house. But it was Catherine Howard who caught his attention, and more importantly, who returned his interest. Catherine was already showing signs of the beauty that would later captivate Henry VIII. She had lustrous dark hair, bright eyes, and a vivacious personality that masked a desperate need for affection and security. Raised in a household where she was largely ignored by adults, Catherine had learned to find validation through the attention of men. Francis, several years her senior and considerably more experienced, recognized this vulnerability and exploited it with devastating effectiveness. The relationship that developed between Francis and Catherine went far beyond the innocent flirtation one might expect in such circumstances. According to later testimony, Francis used many persuasions to procure Catherine to his vicious purpose, and eventually gained access to her bed. Catherine herself would later admit that Francis had obtained first to lie upon my bed with his doublet and hose, and after within the bed, and finally, he lay with me naked. But this was not merely a physical relationship. Francis and Catherine exchanged love tokens, gifts that in Tudor society carried the weight of engagement rings. They spoke of marriage, made promises to each other, and conducted themselves as if they were legally bound. In the loose moral atmosphere of the Duchess's household, their relationship was an open secret, tolerated if not officially approved. The affair lasted for approximately 3 months, during which time Francis treated Catherine as his wife in all but name. He was possessive, jealous, and protective of her. When other young men in the household showed interest in Catherine, Francis made it clear that she was his. He spoke of their future together, of the life they would build, and of the children they would have. For Catherine, who had never known secure affection, Francis represented everything she had ever wanted: love, protection, and a place in the world. But Francis Dereham was not content to remain a gentleman's servant forever. He had ambitions, and he understood that his relationship with Catherine Howard could be either his salvation or his destruction. When Catherine was suddenly called to court in late 1539, summoned by her powerful uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, Francis must have sensed that his world was about to change forever. The Duke of Norfolk was one of Henry VIII's most trusted advisors, and he had been watching his young niece with calculating eyes. Catherine's beauty and charm had not gone unnoticed, and her uncle saw in her an opportunity to advance his own position at court. The king's third wife, Jane Seymour, had died in childbirth, and his fourth marriage to Anne of Cleves had been an unmitigated disaster. Henry was once again in the market for a wife, and Norfolk intended to provide one. For Francis, Catherine's departure for court represented both opportunity and danger. On one hand, if Catherine caught the king's attention and became queen, Francis's prior relationship with her could potentially be leveraged into a powerful position. On the other hand, if Henry discovered their previous intimacy, the consequences could be fatal. Francis chose to gamble, following Catherine to court and seeking a position that would allow him to remain close to her. This decision would prove to be the first step on Francis's path to the executioner's block. By pursuing Catherine to court, he was not only risking his own life, but also endangering the woman he claimed to love. In Tudor England, a queen's sexual past was not merely a private matter. It was a question of national security. If Catherine had been legally married to Francis, her subsequent marriage to Henry would be invalid. If she had merely been his lover, she had deceived the king about her virginity, a deception that could be construed as treason. As Francis settled into his new position at court, he must have been acutely aware that he was walking a tightrope. One wrong move, one careless word, one moment of jealousy, and everything could come crashing down. He had to watch the woman he loved become queen, knowing that he could never again hold her in his arms. He had to smile and bow and play the part of the loyal servant, all while carrying the dangerous secret of their past relationship. The irony was that Francis's love for Catherine, the very emotion that had brought him to court, was also what would destroy him. Unable to let go of the past, unable to accept that Catherine belonged to another man, Francis would make the fatal mistakes that would lead him to the torture chamber and the executioner's block. Francis Dereham's arrival at Henry VIII court in 1540 placed him in one of the most dangerous environments in Tudor England. The court was a maze of competing factions, shifting alliances, and deadly rivalries, where a single misstep could mean the difference between advancement and annihilation. For Francis, who carried the explosive secret of his relationship with the new queen, every conversation was a potential trap, every glance a possible betrayal. Henry VIII court was not simply a royal household. It was the beating heart of English politics, where the fate of the kingdom was decided through whispered conversations and subtle maneuvers. The king himself was a towering, intimidating figure, physically imposing despite his increasing weight, intellectually formidable despite his growing paranoia, and absolutely ruthless in his pursuit of what he perceived as his interests. At 50 years old, Henry had already executed 2 wives and countless courtiers, and he showed no signs of developing mercy in his old age. Catherine Howard's position as the new queen placed her at the center of this volatile environment. At barely 20 years old, she was utterly unprepared for the responsibilities and dangers of her role. She had been thrust into a world where every word was analyzed, every gesture scrutinized, and every relationship potentially treasonous. The young woman who had once freely given her affection to Francis now found herself the most watched person in England. For Francis, watching Catherine navigate this treacherous landscape must have been torturous. The woman he loved was now surrounded by spies, advisors, and rivals who would not hesitate to destroy her if it served their purposes. He could see her struggling with the weight of her new position, but he could do nothing to help her without revealing their past relationship, a revelation that would doom them both. The court was divided into several major factions, each with their own agenda. The conservative Catholics, led by the Duke of Norfolk and including Francis's own patron, the Dowager Duchess, sought to use Catherine's influence to roll back the Protestant reforms that had swept through England. The Protestant reformers, led by men like Thomas Cranmer and Thomas Cromwell, before his execution in 1540, viewed Catherine with suspicion and sought to limit her influence. Between these two extremes moved a collection of ambitious courtiers, each seeking to advance their own position through careful alliance and betrayal. Francis found himself caught between these competing factions, his position made even more precarious by his past relationship with the Queen. He had been appointed to a minor position in the royal household, ostensibly through the influence of his former patron, the Dowager Duchess. But everyone at court understood that patronage came with a price, and Francis's relatively humble origins made him an easy target for those seeking to advance their own positions. The psychological pressure on Francis during this period must have been immense. He was forced to maintain the facade of a loyal servant while carrying the knowledge that he had been intimate with the Queen. He had to watch Catherine with other men, knowing that her life depended on her ability to satisfy the king's desires. He had to smile and bow and play the part of the grateful courtier, all while knowing that his mere presence at court represented a mortal threat to the woman he loved. Making matters worse was the fact that Francis was not the only person at court who knew about his relationship with Catherine. Several servants and minor nobles from the Dowager Duchess's household had also found positions at court, and they carried with them the same dangerous knowledge. The secret was like a ticking bomb, and Francis must have known that it was only a matter of time before it exploded. The first sign of trouble came in the form of gossip. Court was a place where information was currency, and stories about the Queen's past began to circulate among the lower levels of the royal household. These were not yet formal accusations, but rather whispered speculation about Catherine's behavior before her marriage to the king. Francis must have heard these rumors and understood that they represented the first tremors of an earthquake that would soon tear his world apart. The situation became even more dangerous when Catherine began to show favor to Francis in small ways. Perhaps she remembered their past affection, perhaps she felt guilty about their separation, or perhaps she simply wanted to have someone at court who genuinely cared for her. Whatever her motivations, Catherine began to seek out Francis's company, to ask for his advice, and to treat him with a familiarity that was noticed by the ever-watchful eyes of the court. This favoritism was exactly the kind of behavior that could doom them both. In Tudor England, a queen's relationship with male courtiers was closely monitored, and any sign of impropriety was potentially treasonous. Francis understood this better than Catherine, and he must have been terrified by her attention even as he was drawn to it. The woman he loved was inadvertently creating the evidence that would be used to destroy them both. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Henry VIII began to show signs of dissatisfaction with his new wife. Catherine's youth and inexperience were beginning to grate on the king, who had expected her to be a sophisticated partner in the complex game of court politics. Her tendency to surround herself with young people from her past, including Francis, was exactly the kind of behavior that aroused Henry's suspicions about her loyalty and fitness to be queen. By the summer of 1541, Francis must have realized that his position was becoming untenable. The rumors about Catherine's past were growing stronger, the king's mood was darkening, and the court was beginning to polarize around the question of the Queen's fitness for her role. Francis was trapped in a situation where he could neither advance nor retreat, neither speak nor remain silent, neither stay nor leave. He was caught in the machinery of Tudor politics, and that machinery was beginning to grind him to pieces. The final catalyst came from an unexpected source. In the autumn of 1541, a former servant named John Lascelles approached Archbishop Thomas Cranmer with explosive information about Catherine Howard's past. Lascelles, motivated by a combination of religious fervor and personal ambition, revealed the details of Catherine's relationship with Francis Dereham and others. The information was too detailed, too specific, and too dangerous to ignore. When Cranmer brought this information to Henry VIII, the king's reaction was swift and terrible. Within days, Francis found himself under arrest, charged with treason against the crown. The love affair that had begun in innocence and hope had become a capital crime, and Francis faced the prospect of the most horrifying death that Tudor justice could devise. The arrest of Francis Dereham came with the swift, brutal efficiency that characterized Henry VIII's justice system. On November 2, 1541, guards arrived at his chambers before dawn, their footsteps echoing through the silent corridors of Hampton Court Palace. Francis, who had been living under a cloud of growing suspicion for weeks, may have been expecting this moment, but nothing could have prepared him for the reality of his situation. The guards who arrested Francis were not there to engage in conversation or explanation. They were instruments of the king's will, and their job was to transport a prisoner, not to provide comfort or information. Francis was given no time to dress properly, no opportunity to send messages to allies or family, no chance to prepare himself mentally for what was to come. He was simply seized, shackled, and transported to the Tower of London, where he would spend the final weeks of his life. The Tower of London in 1541 was not merely a prison. It was a symbol of royal power and a place where the king's enemies disappeared forever. As Francis was led through the Traitor's Gate, he was following in the footsteps of countless others who had challenged the Tudor monarchy and paid the ultimate price. And Bullen had walked these same stones, Thomas More had been held in these same cells, and Thomas Cromwell had met his end in these same chambers. The Tower was where the king's justice was dispensed, and that justice was neither merciful nor forgiving. Francis's cell was a small, cold chamber in the Beauchamp Tower, where he was kept under constant guard. The conditions were deliberately harsh, designed to break down the prisoner's resistance and make him more amenable to confession. The food was minimal, the bedding inadequate, and the temperature barely above freezing. Francis, who had grown accustomed to the comforts of court life, found himself reduced to the most basic level of survival. But the physical hardships of imprisonment were nothing compared to the psychological torture that awaited him. Francis knew that his arrest was not merely a matter of routine questioning. It was the beginning of a process that would end with his execution. The only question was whether he would be able to minimize the damage to Catherine Howard and perhaps negotiate a less brutal form of death for himself. The interrogation of Francis Dereham was conducted by some of the most skilled and ruthless officials in Henry VIII government. These men were not interested in justice in any modern sense. They were interested in obtaining information that would serve the king's political needs. They understood that Francis possessed detailed knowledge of Catherine Howard's past, and they were prepared to use any means necessary to extract that information. The interrogation techniques employed by Tudor officials were sophisticated and brutal. They began with relatively gentle questioning, hoping to catch Francis in contradictions or admissions that could be used against him. When this approach failed to produce the desired results, they escalated to more aggressive methods. Francis was subjected to sleep deprivation, prolonged standing, and psychological pressure designed to break down his resistance. The questions focused relentlessly on Francis's relationship with Catherine Howard. The interrogators wanted to know every detail of their intimacy, every conversation they had shared, every promise they had made to each other. They were particularly interested in whether Francis and Catherine had been legally married, a question that would have profound implications for the validity of Catherine's marriage to Henry VIII. Francis found himself in an impossible position. If he admitted to the full extent of his relationship with Catherine, he would be providing evidence that could be used to destroy her. If he denied the relationship, he would be contradicting testimony that had already been given by other witnesses, and his lies would be easily exposed. If he claimed that he and Catherine had been legally married, he would be asserting that the king's marriage was invalid, a claim that would certainly result in his execution. The psychological pressure on Francis during these interrogations was immense. He was cut off from all contact with the outside world, uncertain about Catherine's fate, and facing the prospect of the most brutal execution method available under English law. The interrogators played on his fears, his love for Catherine, and his desperate hope that he might somehow survive this ordeal. As the interrogations continued, Francis began to understand the broader political context of his situation. His arrest was not simply about his relationship with Catherine Howard. It was part of a larger effort by Henry VIII to eliminate anyone who might challenge his authority or threaten his dynasty. The king was using Francis's case to send a message about the consequences of defying royal will, and Francis was to be the example that would terrify future generations of courtiers. The evidence against Francis was overwhelming. Multiple witnesses had testified about his relationship with Catherine. Love letters had been discovered, and physical evidence of their intimacy had been documented. The interrogators made it clear that Francis's guilt was not in question. The only issue was the extent of his cooperation in providing information about others who might have been involved in the conspiracy. Francis's responses to the interrogation varied as his situation became more desperate. At times, he attempted to minimize his relationship with Catherine, portraying it as a youthful indiscretion that had no bearing on her fitness to be queen. At other times, he tried to shift blame to others, suggesting that he had been manipulated or coerced into the relationship. Occasionally, he showed flashes of defiance, asserting his innocence and challenging the legitimacy of the charges against him. But none of these strategies worked. The interrogators had anticipated every possible defense, and they had prepared counter-arguments for every claim Francis might make. They showed him testimony from other witnesses, confronted him with physical evidence, and systematically destroyed every argument he presented. Francis was trapped in a legal and political machinery that was designed to produce only one outcome: his conviction and execution. The interrogation process lasted for several weeks, during which time Francis's physical and mental condition deteriorated rapidly. The combination of poor food, inadequate sleep, constant questioning, and psychological pressure took its toll on his health and sanity. The man who had once been a confident courtier was reduced to a broken prisoner, desperate for any hope of survival. As the interrogation drew to a close, Francis must have realized that there was no escape from his fate. The evidence against him was too strong, the political pressure too great, and the king's will too absolute. He was going to be executed, and the only remaining question was whether he would face the full horror of hanging, drawing, and quartering, or whether he might be granted the mercy of a quicker death. The final sessions of the interrogation focused on extracting a confession that would serve the king's political needs. Francis was pressured to admit not only to his relationship with Catherine but also to a broader conspiracy against the crown. The interrogators wanted him to implicate others, to provide evidence of a treasonous plot that would justify the harsh measures being taken against all of Catherine's associates. Francis's ultimate decision to confess was not a matter of choice but of necessity. The evidence against him was overwhelming, his situation was hopeless, and his only remaining hope was that his cooperation might somehow benefit Catherine or result in a more merciful death for himself. The confession he eventually signed was a document that sealed his fate and provided the legal justification for the horrible death that awaited him. The trial of Francis Dereham was a foregone conclusion, a theatrical performance designed to provide a veneer of legality to what was essentially a royal execution. On December 1, 1541, Francis was brought before the court at the Guildhall in London, where he faced charges of high treason against the crown. The proceedings that followed would demonstrate the complete absence of justice in Tudor England, where the king's will was the only law that mattered. The Guildhall was packed with spectators who had come to witness the downfall of the man who had dared to love a queen. The atmosphere was charged with excitement and morbid curiosity, as Londoners gathered to see how the drama that had been unfolding at court would reach its climax. For many in the crowd, this was entertainment, a break from the monotony of their daily lives. For Francis, it was the final act of a tragedy that had begun with whispered promises of love. The presiding judge was Sir William Powlett, a man who had built his career on unwavering loyalty to Henry VIII, and who understood that his role was not to determine guilt or innocence, but to provide legal justification for a predetermined outcome. Powlett was accompanied by a panel of nobles and legal officials, all of whom owed their positions to the king's favor and who would not dare to contradict his will. The charges against Francis were read aloud in the formal language of Tudor law, but their essential meaning was clear. He was accused of concealing his relationship with Catherine Howard from the king, thereby deceiving the crown and compromising the security of the realm. The specific charge was misprision of treason, which carried the same penalty as treason itself: death by hanging, drawing, and quartering. Francis was not provided with legal representation, as was customary in treason cases. The assumption was that anyone charged with such a serious crime was obviously guilty, and the role of the court was simply to establish the facts and impose the appropriate sentence. Francis was expected to represent himself, to respond to the charges, and to provide any evidence he might have in his defense. The prosecution's case was presented by Sir Richard Rich, the Solicitor General, who had built his reputation on his ability to prosecute the king's enemies effectively. Rich was a skilled lawyer and a ruthless politician who understood that his job was not to seek truth but to ensure conviction. He presented the evidence against Francis with methodical precision, building a case that was both legally sound and politically expedient. The evidence presented against Francis was overwhelming and damning. Witnesses testified about his relationship with Catherine Howard, describing intimate details that left no doubt about the nature of their connection. Love letters were read aloud, physical evidence was displayed, and testimony from servants and courtiers painted a picture of a man who had deliberately concealed vital information from the crown. Perhaps most damaging was the testimony of Henry VIII, Catherine's former music teacher, who had also been intimate with her before her marriage to the king. VIII, who had been granted immunity in exchange for his cooperation, provided detailed testimony about Catherine's sexual history and Francis's role in it. His testimony was particularly damaging because it corroborated the evidence against Francis while demonstrating that Catherine's deception of the king had been extensive and deliberate. The prosecution also presented evidence of Francis's behavior at court, arguing that his appointment to a position in the royal household, while concealing his relationship with the Queen, constituted a form of fraud. They suggested that Francis had used his prior intimacy with Catherine to gain access to the king's inner circle, where he could potentially gather information or influence policy in ways that threatened the security of the realm. Francis's defense was pathetic and desperate. He attempted to argue that his relationship with Catherine had been legal, claiming that they had been married according to the customs of the time. This argument was immediately dismissed by the court, which ruled that no legal marriage had taken place and that Francis's claims were simply an attempt to legitimize what had been an illicit relationship. Francis also tried to argue that he had not deliberately concealed his relationship with Catherine, claiming that he had assumed the king already knew about it. This defense was equally unsuccessful, as the court ruled that Francis had a positive duty to disclose such information and that his failure to do so constituted a deliberate deception. The most poignant moment of the trial came when Francis was asked to explain his motivations for maintaining his relationship with Catherine after she became queen. His response, recorded by court observers, revealed the depth of his love for her and his inability to accept that their relationship was over. He spoke of Catherine as if she were still the young woman he had known at the Dowager Duchess's household, describing her with a tenderness that was both touching and tragic. But the court was not interested in Francis's feelings or motivations. They were interested in establishing legal justification for his execution, and they had more than enough evidence to accomplish that goal. The testimony against Francis was so overwhelming that the trial quickly became a formality, with the outcome never in doubt. The prosecution's closing argument was a masterpiece of legal and political rhetoric. Rich painted Francis as a dangerous traitor who had deliberately deceived the king and compromised the security of the realm. He argued that Francis's actions had threatened the succession, undermined the authority of the crown, and set a precedent that could encourage other ambitious courtiers to similar acts of treachery. Francis's final statement to the court was a desperate plea for mercy that fell on deaf ears. He admitted his guilt, expressed his remorse, and begged for the king's forgiveness. He spoke of his love for Catherine in terms that were both beautiful and heartbreaking, describing her as the light of his life and the source of his greatest happiness. But he also acknowledged that his love had led him to make decisions that threatened the crown, and he accepted responsibility for the consequences. The verdict was announced with the solemnity that befitted such a serious occasion. Francis was found guilty of misprision of treason and sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. The sentence was pronounced in the traditional language of Tudor law, with each element of the punishment described in gruesome detail. Francis was to be drawn through the streets of London, hanged until nearly dead, disemboweled while still alive, and finally quartered, with his body parts displayed as a warning to others. The reaction in the courtroom was a mixture of satisfaction and horror. Those who supported the king's actions saw the verdict as a necessary demonstration of royal authority. Those who sympathized with Francis or who understood the broader implications of the case were appalled by the severity of the sentence. But none dared to voice their objections in public, as doing so would have been tantamount to challenging the king's judgment. Francis's reaction to the sentence was one of resignation and despair. He had known from the moment of his arrest that this outcome was likely, but hearing the words spoken aloud made the reality of his situation undeniable. He was going to die in the most horrible way possible, and there was nothing he could do to change his fate. The date of execution was set for December 10, 1541, just 9 days after the trial. This short interval was typical of Tudor practice, which favored swift justice over prolonged appeals or attempts at intervention. Francis would have barely a week to prepare himself for death, to make peace with his fate, and to find whatever comfort he could in prayer and meditation. As Francis was led back to his cell in the Tower of London, he must have been acutely aware that his time was running out. The trial had been his last hope for survival, and that hope had been extinguished with brutal efficiency. All that remained was the horrible reality of his approaching execution, a death that would be designed not just to kill him, but to terrorize anyone who might consider following in his footsteps. The execution of Francis Dereham was not merely a matter of killing a condemned man. It was a carefully orchestrated display of royal power, designed to terrorize the population and demonstrate the consequences of defying the crown. The method chosen for Francis, hanging, drawing, and quartering, was the most brutal punishment available under English law, reserved for those convicted of high treason. Understanding the full horror of what awaited Francis requires examining the machinery of death that Tudor England had perfected over centuries. Hanging, drawing, and quartering was a method of torturous capital punishment used principally to execute men convicted of high treason in medieval and early modern Britain. The punishment was designed to be as painful, humiliating, and terrifying as possible, serving not just as retribution but as a deterrent to future traitors. Every aspect of the execution was calculated to maximize suffering and create a spectacle that would be remembered for generations. The process began with the drawing phase, where the convicted traitor was fastened by the feet to a hurdle or wooden panel and drawn behind a horse from the Tower of London to the place of execution at Tyburn. This journey, which covered approximately 3 miles through the crowded streets of London, was itself a form of torture and public humiliation. Francis would be tied to a rough wooden sledge and dragged over cobblestones, through mud and refuse, while crowds gathered to jeer and throw objects at him. The route from the Tower to Tyburn was well established and designed to maximize the public nature of the spectacle. The procession would pass through some of London's most populated areas, ensuring that as many people as possible would witness the King's justice in action. For Francis, this journey would be a nightmare of physical pain and psychological torment, as he was displayed like a piece of meat before the baying crowds. The crowds that gathered to witness executions in Tudor England were not passive observers. They were active participants in the spectacle. They would shout insults, throw rotting vegetables and stones, and generally express their disapproval of the condemned man's crimes. For many Londoners, public executions were a form of entertainment, a break from the monotony of their daily lives. The suffering of the condemned was not merely tolerated but celebrated as evidence of the king's power and justice. The physical trauma of being dragged through the streets would have been severe. The wooden hurdle was designed to be rough and uncomfortable, and the jolting motion as it was pulled over uneven ground would have caused significant pain. Francis's clothes would have been torn away, his skin scraped and bleeding, his body bruised and battered. By the time he reached Tyburn, he would already have been weakened and demoralized by the ordeal. But the drawing was merely the preliminary to the main event. At Tyburn, a permanent gallows had been erected specifically for such executions. The gallows was not simply a functional structure. It was a monument to royal power, designed to be both imposing and terrifying. The sight of the gallows, with its thick wooden beams and iron fixtures, would have filled Francis with dread as he contemplated what was about to happen to him. The actual execution began with the hanging phase, but this was not the quick death that might be expected from a modern execution. Francis would be hanged by the neck, but only until he was nearly unconscious, not until he was dead. The executioner was skilled in judging exactly how long to maintain the hanging to cause maximum suffering without causing death. Francis would experience the terror of strangulation, the panic of being unable to breathe, and the agony of slowly losing consciousness, all while knowing that this was only the beginning of his ordeal. The timing of this phase was crucial. If Francis lost consciousness too quickly, he would miss the worst part of his punishment. If he died during the hanging, the subsequent torture would be meaningless. The executioner had to maintain a delicate balance, keeping Francis alive and conscious enough to experience the full horror of what was to come. When Francis was cut down from the gallows, he would have been barely conscious, gasping for breath, his throat damaged and his body racked with pain. But there would be no respite, no moment of relief. The executioner would immediately begin the most horrifying phase of the punishment, the disembowelment. The final step of hanging, drawing, and quartering was to cut off the condemned man's head and then quarter his remaining corpse by carving it into 4 pieces. But before the quartering came the disembowelment, a process that was designed to be as painful and degrading as possible. Francis would be stripped naked, laid on a wooden table, and held down while the executioner cut open his abdomen and removed his internal organs. The executioner would begin by making a long incision in Francis's abdomen, carefully avoiding vital organs that would cause immediate death. The intestines would be pulled out and displayed to the crowd, who would cheer and jeer at the sight. The heart would be removed and held up, often while still beating, as a symbol of the traitor's corrupt nature. Each organ would be thrown into a fire that burned nearby, filling the air with smoke and the stench of burning flesh. Throughout this process, Francis would be conscious and aware of what was happening to him. The pain would be indescribable, an agony beyond anything he could have imagined. He would see his own organs being removed, smell them burning, and know that his body was being systematically destroyed. The psychological trauma would be as severe as the physical pain, as Francis confronted the reality of his own mortality in the most brutal way possible. The crowd's reaction to this phase of the execution was typically one of bloodthirsty enthusiasm. They would cheer when particularly gruesome moments occurred, laugh at the condemned man's suffering, and generally treat the whole spectacle as a form of entertainment. For many spectators, the sight of a traitor being disemboweled was deeply satisfying, a confirmation that justice was being served and that the king's authority was absolute. The executioner's skill was crucial during this phase. He had to maintain Francis's consciousness while inflicting maximum pain, ensuring that the condemned man experienced every moment of his punishment. If Francis lost consciousness too quickly, the executioner might revive him with smelling salts or other methods. The goal was not simply to kill, but to create a spectacle of suffering that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. The final phase of the execution was the quartering, where Francis's body would be cut into 4 pieces. By this point, Francis would likely be dead or very close to death, but the mutilation of his corpse served important symbolic and practical purposes. The executioner would use a large cleaver or axe to separate the arms and legs from the torso, creating 4 quarters that would be displayed throughout London as a warning to potential traitors. The head would be removed separately and often placed on a spike at London Bridge, where it would remain for months or even years as a grisly reminder of the fate that awaited those who opposed the crown. The 4 quarters of the body would be displayed at the city gates or other prominent locations, where they would slowly decompose in public view. This final humiliation ensured that Francis's punishment would continue long after his death, serving as a permanent warning to anyone who might consider similar acts of treason. The entire process, from the hanging to the final quartering, typically took between 30 minutes and an hour to complete. For Francis, it would have been an eternity of unimaginable suffering, a systematic destruction of his body that was designed to be as painful and degrading as possible. The execution was not merely a method of killing. It was a form of torture that reflected the absolute power of the Tudor monarchy and the price of defying royal authority. The 9 days between Francis Dereham's sentencing and his execution were a period of profound psychological torture, perhaps even more cruel than the physical death that awaited him. Confined to his cell in the Tower of London, Francis faced the ultimate test of human endurance. The knowledge of exactly when and how he would die, combined with the complete helplessness to prevent it. The Tower of London had been designed not just as a prison but as a place of psychological warfare. The thick stone walls, the narrow windows, the constant dampness and cold. All of these elements were calculated to break down the spirits of those confined within. Francis's cell was barely large enough for a man to lie down, with a small window that provided just enough light to remind him of the world he was about to leave forever. The guards who watched over Francis during these final days were not chosen for their compassion. They were men who had become hardened to suffering, who viewed their prisoners as already dead and therefore unworthy of human consideration. They spoke to Francis only when necessary, provided him with minimal food and water, and maintained a constant watch to ensure that he did not attempt to cheat the executioner by taking his own life. Francis's mental state during these final days can only be imagined. He had been a man of action, accustomed to making decisions and controlling his destiny. Now he was reduced to passive waiting, counting down the hours until his appointment with death. The psychological pressure was enormous, as he struggled to maintain his sanity while contemplating the horror that awaited him. The knowledge of how he would die was perhaps the worst aspect of his situation. Francis had undoubtedly witnessed executions before, as public executions were common entertainment in Tudor England. He would have known exactly what hanging, drawing, and quartering involved, and he would have been able to visualize every detail of his approaching ordeal. This knowledge would have made sleep impossible, food tasteless, and every moment a struggle against despair. During these final days, Francis would have been visited by a priest, as was customary for condemned prisoners. The priest's role was supposedly to provide spiritual comfort and to prepare the condemned man for death. In practice, however, these visits often served the crown's purposes as much as the prisoner's spiritual needs. The priest would encourage Francis to confess his sins, to express remorse for his crimes, and to accept his punishment as just and deserved. The conversations between Francis and the priest would have been deeply personal and emotionally charged. Francis would have been desperate for any comfort, any hope, any sense that his life had meaning despite its approaching end. The priest would have offered him the promise of salvation, but only if he truly repented of his crimes and accepted the justice of his punishment. These conversations would have been a form of psychological manipulation, designed to ensure that Francis would die in a manner that served the crown's interests. Francis would also have been encouraged to write letters of confession and remorse, documents that would be published after his death as proof of his guilt and the justice of his punishment. These letters, whether genuine or coerced, would become part of the official record of his case, serving to justify the crown's actions and to deter future traitors. The physical conditions of Francis's imprisonment would have deteriorated his health significantly during these final days. The poor food, the lack of exercise, the stress, and the cold would have weakened his body and made him more susceptible to illness. By the time of his execution, Francis would have been a shadow of his former self, physically and mentally broken by the ordeal of waiting for death. The nights would have been the worst times for Francis. Alone in his cell, surrounded by darkness and silence, he would have been forced to confront the reality of his situation without any distractions. The approaching execution would have haunted his dreams, if he was able to sleep at all. He would have relived his relationship with Catherine Howard, wondering if different choices might have led to a different outcome. He would have thought about his family, his friends, and all the experiences he would never have. As the date of his execution approached, Francis would have been acutely aware of the preparations being made for his death. He would have heard the sounds of construction as the gallows were prepared, the voices of officials making arrangements, and the growing excitement of the crowds who were gathering to witness the spectacle. These sounds would have been a constant reminder that his death was not just a personal tragedy but a public entertainment. The final day before his execution would have been particularly difficult for Francis. He would have known that he was experiencing his last sunrise, his last meal, his last moments of consciousness before the ordeal began. The realization that he would never again see Catherine Howard, never again experience love or friendship or any of the pleasures of life, would have been devastating. On the morning of December 10, 1541, Francis would have been awakened before dawn for his final preparations. He would have been given the opportunity to wash and dress, to receive final communion, and to make any last statements he wished to leave behind. These rituals were designed to provide a sense of dignity and closure, but they would also have served as a final reminder of what was about to happen. On the morning of December 10, 1541, Francis would have been awakened before dawn for his final preparations. He would have been given the opportunity to wash and dress, to receive final communion, and to make any last statements he wished to leave behind. These rituals were designed to provide a sense of dignity and closure, but they would also have served as a final reminder of what was about to happen. As Francis was dragged through the streets of London, he would have seen the faces of the crowd, some sympathetic, some hostile, most simply curious. He would have realized that his death was not just a personal tragedy but a public spectacle, a form of entertainment for people who had come to see the king's justice in action. This realization would have been perhaps the final and most bitter humiliation of his ordeal. December 10th, 1541, dawned gray and bitter cold over London, with a sharp wind that cut through the thickest clothing and carried the promise of snow. The weather seemed to mirror the grim mood of the occasion, as if nature itself was mourning the approaching horror. For Francis Dereham, this would be his last dawn, his final glimpse of the world he had known and loved. The preparations for the execution had begun hours before sunrise. At Tyburn, the permanent gallows stood ready, its thick wooden beams dark with age and stained with the blood of countless previous victims. The executioner, a skilled professional who had performed this terrible duty many times before, checked his tools and prepared the fire that would consume Francis's organs. The crowd barriers were erected, and the guards took their positions to control what would inevitably be a large and unruly mob. In his cell at the Tower of London, Francis was awakened before dawn by the sound of approaching footsteps. The guards who came for him were not the same men who had watched over him during his imprisonment. These were the officials responsible for carrying out the execution, men who viewed their task as a solemn duty rather than a routine chore. They spoke to Francis with formal courtesy, addressing him by his title and treating him with the respect due to a condemned nobleman. Francis was given time to wash and dress, rituals that served both practical and psychological purposes. The washing was symbolic, representing a cleansing of sins before death, while the dressing allowed the condemned man to maintain some dignity in his final moments. Francis would have been provided with clean clothes, simple but appropriate for his station, and he would have been allowed to arrange his appearance as he wished. The final religious preparations were crucial to the ceremony. Francis was visited by a priest who offered him communion and the last rites of the church. This was not merely a spiritual comfort but a political necessity, as the crown needed to demonstrate that the condemned man had been given every opportunity to make peace with God before his death. The priest would have encouraged Francis to confess his sins publicly, to express remorse for his crimes, and to ask for the king's forgiveness. The breakfast offered to Francis would have been simple but substantial, designed to give him strength for the ordeal ahead. Condemned men were traditionally allowed to eat whatever they desired for their final meal, within reason, and Francis might have requested something that reminded him of happier times. The irony was bitter. He was being fed to ensure that he would be strong enough to endure the maximum amount of suffering during his execution. As the morning progressed, Francis would have been acutely aware of the sounds of preparation outside his cell. The voices of officials making final arrangements, the clatter of horses and carts, the growing murmur of the crowd. All of these sounds would have served as a countdown to his death. Each noise would have been a reminder that the machinery of execution was moving forward inexorably toward its conclusion. The moment of departure from the tower came with ceremonial solemnity. Francis was led from his cell by a procession of guards, officials, and clergy, all of whom had specific roles to play in the drama that was about to unfold. The sight of the Thames and the London skyline as he left the tower would have been poignant, a final glimpse of the world he was about to leave forever. The hurdle to which Francis was bound was a rough wooden sledge, designed to be uncomfortable and degrading. He was tied by the feet and sometimes by the waist, positioned so that he would be dragged backwards through the streets, unable to see where he was going but fully aware of every bump and jolt. The binding was tight enough to prevent escape but not so tight as to cause immediate injury. That would come later. The procession that formed around Francis was elaborate and carefully choreographed. At the front rode the Sheriff of London and his officers, followed by the executioner and his assistants. Behind them came the hurdle-bearing Francis, surrounded by guards on foot and horseback. The rear of the procession was occupied by clergy and officials, all of whom had roles to play in the ceremony. The route from the Tower to Tyburn was approximately 3 miles, following well-established streets that would provide maximum exposure to the public. The procession moved slowly, partly for ceremonial reasons and partly to ensure that Francis would suffer as much as possible during the journey. The rough cobblestones and the jolting motion of the hurdle would have caused intense pain, while the crowds that lined the route would have provided constant humiliation. The crowds that gathered to witness Francis's final journey were massive, drawn by the spectacle of seeing a man who had loved a queen meet his fate. These were not passive observers but active participants in the drama, shouting insults, throwing objects, and generally expressing their disapproval of Francis's crimes. For many, this was entertainment, a break from the monotony of their daily lives. The physical ordeal of being dragged through the streets was severe. Francis's clothes would have been torn away by the rough wood and the cobblestones, his skin scraped and bleeding, his body bruised and battered. The positioning of his body on the hurdle would have made breathing difficult, while the noise and chaos around him would have been overwhelming. By the time he reached Tyburn, Francis would have been weakened and demoralized, but still conscious enough to face the worst part of his ordeal. The arrival at Tyburn marked the transition from the ceremonial procession to the actual execution. The crowd here was even larger and more boisterous, drawn by the promise of witnessing the most brutal form of execution available under English law. The atmosphere was charged with excitement and bloodthirsty anticipation, as spectators jostled for the best view of the proceedings. The gallows at Tyburn were a permanent fixture, designed to be both functional and intimidating. The thick wooden beams, the iron fixtures, the platform for the executioner. All of these elements were calculated to strike fear into the hearts of those who saw them. For Francis, the sight of the gallows would have been the final confirmation that his death was imminent and inevitable. The final preparations at Tyburn were carried out with professional efficiency. Francis was removed from the hurdle and allowed to stand, though he would have been weak and barely able to support himself. The executioner checked his equipment one final time, ensuring that everything was ready for the terrible work ahead. The fire was built up to ensure that it would burn hot enough to consume the organs that would soon be thrown into it. The crowd fell silent as Francis was given the opportunity to make his final speech. This was a traditional part of the execution ceremony, and the condemned man was expected to confess his crimes, express remorse, and ask for forgiveness. Francis's speech, if he made one, would have been carefully crafted to serve the crown's interests while providing some measure of personal dignity in his final moments. The hanging began immediately after Francis finished speaking. The noose was placed around his neck, and he was raised from the ground, not by dropping through a trapdoor as in later executions, but by being pulled up by the rope. The sensation would have been one of immediate strangulation, panic, and desperate struggle for air. Francis would have felt his life ebbing away, his vision darkening, his consciousness fading. But the executioner was skilled in judging exactly when to cut Francis down. Too soon, and he would recover too quickly. Too late, and he would die before experiencing the worst of his punishment. The timing was crucial, and the executioner had to balance the need to cause maximum suffering with the requirement to keep Francis alive for the final phases of his execution. When Francis was cut down from the gallows, he would have been barely conscious, gasping for breath, his throat damaged and his body convulsing. But there was no respite, no moment of mercy. The executioner and his assistants immediately began the process of disembowelment, the most horrifying part of the entire ordeal. The death of Francis Dereham on December 10, 1541, marked the end of one man's life but the beginning of a broader reign of terror that would claim many more victims. The execution had achieved its intended purpose, to demonstrate the absolute power of Henry VIII and the consequences of defying royal authority. But the ripple effects of Francis's death would extend far beyond the immediate political crisis, influencing the course of English history and the development of the Tudor state. The immediate aftermath of the execution was one of satisfied brutality. The crowd that had gathered at Tyburn dispersed slowly, their bloodlust temporarily sated by the spectacle they had witnessed. The gruesome remains of Francis's body were collected and prepared for display throughout London, where they would serve as a constant reminder of the fate that awaited traitors. His head was placed on a spike at London Bridge, joining the collection of other executed criminals in a grisly gallery of royal justice. For Henry VIII, the execution of Francis Dereham represented a successful assertion of his authority in the face of a serious threat to his dynasty. The king had discovered that his fifth wife had deceived him about her sexual past, and he had responded with characteristic brutality. The execution sent a clear message to his subjects. Anyone who dared to compromise the dignity of the crown would face the most horrible death imaginable. The political implications of Francis's execution were significant. The case had exposed the factional divisions within Henry's court, revealing the extent to which noble families were willing to use their female relatives as pawns in the game of dynastic politics. The Howard family, in particular, had been devastated by the scandal, with several members facing execution or imprisonment. The Duke of Norfolk, Catherine's uncle and one of Henry's most trusted advisors, found himself under suspicion and was forced to distance himself from his disgraced relatives. The execution also had profound implications for the future of royal marriage in England. Henry's violent reaction to Catherine's deception established a precedent that would influence the behavior of future queens and their families. The message was clear. Any woman who married the king must be absolutely pure, and any man who had known her intimately before her marriage was signing his own death warrant. Catherine Howard herself was executed just 2 months after Francis, on February 13, 1542. Her death was carried out with the same brutal efficiency that had characterized Francis's execution, though as a queen she was granted the mercy of beheading rather than the full horror of hanging, drawing, and quartering. The young woman who had once exchanged love tokens with Francis in the Dowager Duchess's garden met her end on Tower Green, another victim of the Tudor marriage machinery. The broader impact of these executions on English society was significant. The case demonstrated the extent to which the Tudor state had developed into a surveillance apparatus capable of uncovering the most intimate details of its subjects' lives. The interrogation techniques used against Francis and the others involved in the case represented a new level of governmental intrusion into private life, establishing precedents that would be used in future political prosecutions. The legal implications of Francis's case were also important. The charge of misprision of treason, used against him, was relatively new, created to catch those who had knowledge of treasonous activities but had not directly participated in them. The successful prosecution of Francis under this charge expanded the definition of treason and made it easier for the crown to prosecute its enemies in the future. The execution of Francis Dereham also had cultural and literary implications that would persist for centuries. The story of the doomed love affair between Francis and Catherine Howard became part of English folklore, inspiring countless ballads, poems, and plays. The tragic tale of young love destroyed by royal politics resonated with audiences who understood the arbitrary nature of Tudor justice and the powerlessness of individuals caught in the machinery of state. The method of execution used against Francis, hanging, drawing, and quartering, continued to be employed against traitors for centuries after his death. The brutality of the punishment was seen as necessary to maintain royal authority and to deter future acts of treason. It was not until 1870 that the punishment was finally abolished, replaced by the more humane method of hanging. The Tower of London, where Francis spent his final days, became even more notorious as a place of imprisonment and execution. The cell where he was held was later occupied by other famous prisoners, including Lady Jane Grey, Thomas More, and countless others who had fallen afoul of royal authority. The Tower's reputation as a place of terror and death was enhanced by cases like Francis's, where the full machinery of Tudor justice was displayed in all its horrible efficiency. The Tyburn Gallows, where Francis met his end, continued to be used for public executions until 1783. The site became synonymous with death and suffering, a place where the worst criminals and political prisoners were brought to face the ultimate punishment. The crowds that gathered to witness these executions were following a tradition that had been established by cases like Francis's, where the spectacle of death served both as entertainment and as a reminder of royal power. The investigation techniques used in Francis's case also established precedents that would influence the development of police work and criminal investigation. The systematic gathering of evidence, the use of witnesses and informants, and the psychological pressure applied during interrogation all became standard practices in later criminal cases. The Tudor state's ability to uncover and prosecute complex conspiracies was demonstrated by the thoroughness with which Francis's case was investigated. The case also highlighted the dangerous position of servants and minor nobles in Tudor society. Francis's status as a gentleman's servant had given him access to the royal court, but it had also made him vulnerable to the whims of his social superiors. His execution demonstrated that proximity to power could be as dangerous as it was advantageous, and that the price of ambition could be death. The propaganda value of Francis's execution was enormous. The Crown used the case to demonstrate the consequences of treason and to reinforce the message that royal authority was absolute. The detailed accounts of the investigation, trial, and execution were widely distributed, serving as both entertainment and political education for the English people. The psychological impact of Francis's execution on those who witnessed it or heard about it was profound. The brutal nature of the punishment was designed to create fear and to discourage any thoughts of resistance to royal authority. The execution served as a form of mass psychological conditioning, teaching the English people that their king was capable of the most extreme violence and that defying him was tantamount to suicide. The case also demonstrated the extent to which personal relationships could become political weapons in Tudor England. Francis's love for Catherine Howard, which had begun as a private affair between two young people, became a matter of national security when Catherine became queen. The transformation of private emotions into public crimes was a hallmark of Tudor politics, where the personal and the political were inextricably linked. Thank you for watching Silent Atrocities. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want more absolutely insane historical content that your teachers were too polite to mention, hit that subscribe button right now, share and comment below. See you in the next one.